This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 274 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. This is the first ever 10 Trends episode, so I wanted to kick things off today with a little explanation of what this show is going to be about. Spoiler alert, it's about 10 trends. I'm just going to go over 10 data-related things that I think are interesting and could help you make better decisions for your fantasy football team. They could be on the player level, or they might be on the team level. Because no regular season games have been played yet this year, today's trends are going to be a little bit different than what you'll get during the regular season, but hopefully they'll still be helpful. Now, before talking about those trends, I wanted to let you guys know that with the regular season starting, FanDuel is back with their marquee Sunday Million contest with $3.5 million in prizes up for grabs here in Week 1. For just a $9 entry fee, take your shot at the $1 million first place prize this Sunday. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. All right, let's get to trend 1. Last season, Seattle had a neutral script pass-to-rush attempt ratio of 0.84 and an overall pass-to-rush attempt ratio of 0.80. Those were the lowest marks in the league. Since 2011, there have been 17 teams with a neutral script ratio less than 1. So teams who ran more than they threw when games had a point margin of plus or minus 6 points. Of those 17 teams, only 2 saw that number decrease the following year. And 13 of the 17 had a neutral script ratio above 1 during that second season. The Seahawks want to run the football, but they're unlikely to run at the same rate as they did last season. I talked about Tyler Lockett on the 15 Transaction show yesterday and how there's a chance for some shootouts for Seattle during the early portion of their season. And that could really help with them seeing a rise in pass-to-rush attempt ratio. I know what I said on the show about a month and a half ago. I explained why I didn't fully understand Russell Wilson's ADP. And I still think the logic to that argument is there. You can't simply say that he's going to pass more and be a better fantasy asset without looking at number 1, Brian Schottenheimer as his offensive coordinator, and number 2, the fact that he had a really unsustainable touchdown rate last year. If you think Seattle's going to throw the ball like 520 times this year, then I'd say that you probably drafted and feel good about Russell Wilson. I still am not optimistic enough to say that he's going to get past 500. That's why I'm just a little bit lower. But I also know that Russell Wilson is one of the best quarterbacks in the league, and I understand the range of outcomes here. And historic data, this particular trend really does shed positive light on that situation. Expect the Seahawks to be more pass-heavy this year. How much more is the big question mark. Over the last 2 years, we've seen running backs get over 20% of the league's targets. That didn't happen once from 2011 through 2016. Now, this trend is interesting because of its tie to the supply of usable running backs in fantasy football. Part of the reason that every down backs are so useful is because they're a rare commodity. They're unicorns. And generally speaking, to get that player, you have to spend to get him during your draft. But the uptick in receiving volume isn't just going to high-end running backs. Last season, we saw 9 running backs hit 80 targets. From 2011 to 2017, we averaged a little over 4 running backs hitting that mark per season. We're seeing more of the Tariq Cohen, Nyheim Hines, James White, and Jalen Richards emerge as flex options as a result of all this volume going to running backs. This is partially why I'm intrigued by someone like Dare Ogunbowale. Maybe he's this year's Jalen Richard, where in PPR formats he's not a bad flex play, especially in negative game scripts. When Kevin Stefanski took over as offensive coordinator for Minnesota last year, in 3 games, they had a neutral script pass-to-rush attempt ratio of 1.21. That was 1.68 when Stefanski wasn't coordinator. And this is a reason to like Dalvin Cook this year. It's true that targets are more valuable than attempts at running back, but Minnesota also finished 3rd in pass-to-rush touchdown ratio last year. If there's more rushing, we could see more touchdowns swing into Dalvin Cook's favor. Now to this point, this is trend 4, but to this point, we saw Adam Thielen's production drop a good bit in those games with Kevin Stefanski. We actually saw his production regress a little bit before that, but those 3 games saw his target share drop to under 15%. That's a little frightening. What's also a little worrisome is that part of Thielen's drop in production last year happened when they stopped using him so much in the slot. During the second half of last year, Thielen's slot rate fell by about 10 percentage points. And then for what it's worth, in the preseason, according to Pro Football Focus, Adam Thielen has had an 8.3% slot snap rate. It's a super limited sample, don't get me wrong, but he only has played 1 snap from the slot. I'm not writing Adam Thielen off this season at all, but I'm absolutely monitoring how they use him in week 1. Speaking of the slot, according to Pro Football Focus, JuJu Smith-Schuster's played 15% of his snaps from the slot in the preseason. Last year in the regular season, that number was 61.5%. And from that area of the field last year, he caught 4 touchdowns and he had 814 yards. That's about 57% of his yardage and touchdown total from last season. The slot is more advantageous for receivers. That's why I and other fantasy analysts reference it all the time. It's a place to create mismatches. And with JuJu Smith-Schuster, with him no longer playing with Antonio Brown, it's a place where you'd want him to try and maintain his snaps from last year. So, like Adam Thielen, this is one to watch. The next trend is one that could easily do a 180 this year. But over the last 3 years, the Dolphins, led by Adam Gase, have run a total of 2,786 plays offensively. That's the lowest number in football. During that time, the team ranked 31st, which is Chicago. They ran 128 more plays than Miami. That 128 play gap is the same seen between Chicago and the 15th ranked Cardinals. The fear for anyone with a Jets player on their fantasy roster is that New York would just continue this trend from Miami under Adam Gase. But there's reason to believe things will speed up again. When Adam Gase had Peyton Manning, his team's always ranked in the top 7 in pace. And we're already seeing that Gase wants to move the Jets at a faster pace than how things moved with the Dolphins. There was even an article on ESPN last week that talked about how Gase mentioned talent being a key reason for Miami's struggles, specifically on offense. And from that perspective, it makes sense to run at a slower pace when you have a less talented roster. You increase variance. So it's true that things were slow in Miami, but I'm not really expecting that to happen in New York this year. The 7th trend today is that Chris Godwin played every snap with the first team offense during this preseason. This probably isn't all that surprising, or at least it shouldn't be surprising, but Godwin wasn't a full-time player last year at all. He played 70% or more of Tampa Bay's snaps in just 6 games last year. In those games, he averaged 6.8 targets, 50 yards, and a half touchdown per contest. And one of those games was against Baltimore, a team with one of the best secondaries in football. He actually had 3 targets and 0 yards receiving in that game, which brings down some of these averages. Basically, I'm just saying this because Chris Godwin is going to have a great season. Among all 50-plus attempt running back seasons over the last 2 years, only one player appears in the top 10 twice in yards per carry versus his teammates' yards per carry, or the difference between the two. And his name is Aaron Jones. To put this another way, Aaron Jones has outperformed his teammates in yards per carry more dramatically than any other running back in football over the last 2 seasons. There's not necessarily a ton of predictiveness in a statistic like that, but it's confirmation that Aaron Jones is really good, and he should be the clear top back in Green Bay this season. This trend is one that I talked about on my team level regression show back in June, but the Chiefs, according to their overall yardage total last year, had over 12 more touchdowns than they should have. That's based on looking at how many touchdowns a team scored versus how many yards they had going back to 2011. Now, if you look at the other 4 teams who outperformed their touchdown total by 10 or more since 2011, those teams fell in touchdowns the following year by 14, 17, 16, and 14. This isn't me saying that Kansas City is going to be trash offensively, or that you shouldn't be targeting players in that offense. Patrick Mahomes is honestly an outlier breaker. He's not normal, and this offense isn't normal. But we should expect some regression offensively this year, and that particular stat does point to that. And here comes the last trend. When comparing the 2018 season to the 2017 season, Chargers running backs saw their target share jump by about 5%. Meanwhile, Chargers tight ends saw it dip by about 5%. In other words, if you're just using last year's target share numbers to project what's going to happen this season, it's probably not the smartest idea for Los Angeles. Because Hunter Henry is back. This is also why I'm not convinced that Mike Williams is a lock to see this massive boost in volume with Tyrell Williams out of the picture. Because realistically, the Chargers could keep things relatively consistent with their running backs. And that's similar to how the league is thrown to that position more and more. And then Hunter Henry steps in and he gobbles up a lot of the target share that was left by Tyrell Williams. I don't mind Mike Williams per se, and I've drafted him here and there during the summer. But I do think there might be a little bit too much optimism surrounding him given the way that this offense looks. At the very least, it's important to know the relationship here between running back and tight end target share and how Hunter Henry's presence should really change the way the Chargers distribute things through the air. But that's it for today's show. Thanks again for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed the format with this being a new one, and do know that the trend should be even more actionable as games are played this year. But if you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And of course, you can follow me over on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks everyone, I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly Start Sit Show.